Welcome to CRE Unplugged. I'm your host, Ryan Elazari, and we have an exciting episode for you today. Trillions of dollars are being poured into data center develop right now, and most people in commercial real estate are still trying to figure it out. What's hype, where the landmines are, and what's real. Today, we're doing something a little different. We've got two guests joining us, and trust me, you're going to want to hear from both of them. Dillon Zahler is a mechanical engineer and co-founder of Colossus Data Center Advisors, where he led design and execution of gigawatts north of projects. And we also have Nathan Persky, Senior Director of Project Development for Data Center Construction at Dataprana. These two aren't talking headlines, they're talking timelines, power walls, labor shortages, and the real risk behind this trillions of dollars flooding into this space. This conversation about AI demand, power constraints, community pushback, and the execution gap nobody wants to talk about. So buckle up. Nathan and Dillon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Ryan.
I have to ask this question because I'm really curious to hear your answers. When you tell someone at a dinner party what you do, what is normally the response that you get?
I would say it's changed significantly in probably the last 3 years. For most of my life, it was like an eye shrug and be like, sounds too complicated for me. Not interested. In the last probably 3 to 5 years, it's an immediate discussion of, AI, the future of the world, these gigantic macroeconomical questions nobody has the answers to. But yeah, that's been the biggest sort of change lately for me is like it's something that's mainstream and everyone thinks they understand, but it's way more complicated and like layers of depth than you just kind of glean from New York Times articles, right? So
Yeah, my experience has been very close to Dylan's to the point where in the past I got to the point where I would just say I'm in real estate because I was tired of trying to explain it. And they go, okay. And then recently I've added the data center side back to it because it's interesting, but I find most conversations are either about what data center is popping up next to their house, what rare earth minerals they should invest in, or what stocks they should jump on. So I don't read the future.
I definitely feel that those are appropriate like responses from the people you're talking to. I was thinking like maybe some of them don't even know that what data centers are, or they still haven't really understand that asset class. But it seems to me that it has become common knowledge with most people.
well, I mean, it's at the point where when I'm home for holidays, my 93-year-old grandma is asking me about large language models and like the ramifications to the global economy. And I'm like, this is, yeah, beyond, I had to help you, figure out how to log into AOL last week, right? And like, this is the level of like, that you're asking me questions at. So it is super interesting to see like how this stuff, that it's truly an industry that, in my career, nobody even knew existed. Like people, I had to explain, yeah, what data centers were for the longest time. And then when I was done explaining it, they didn't even seem to understand what the explanation was, right? And now it seems to be a much more tangible thing that people can, see, feel, and touch in the stock market, out on the street. So yeah, it's just completely changed the dynamic and perception of the industry with no, I think kind of leads to maybe some of the later topics with no one really guiding the narrative, right? Like it's just people reporting on the industry without anyone really within the industry kind of, helping direct that narrative. And there really aren't many other industries that operate that way.
Yeah, and I would add to that to the layperson, data centers is a very broad term, and sometimes you hear people using digital infrastructure, which makes it even broader.
Mhm.
And they may think that every data center is this massive several $100,000 foot building in this complex that takes up acres of land, where realistically in New York City, you have data center floors, you have data center closets. They come in all shapes and sizes. They end up everywhere across the country and the globe. So it's really a very broad area. You have developers or builders who specialize in different geographies, different build types, different tiers, tier 1 through 4. So there really is a lot there that needs to be unpacked. And the average person, to them, it's just, oh, it's a car. Could be a Ferrari, could be a Honda. It's a car.
Right. I I
Yeah.
would I would suggest or I would think that in the past you probably were going to these parties or you going to the events and you're kind of cringing upon like people coming up to you and asking you what you do. But now you people understand some of the basics of this asset class, so it's kind of more fun.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, I think, yeah, to echo Nathan's point, a common sort of misconception, right? I think is equivalent to kind of perceiving the entire rest of the real estate industry as one thing, and is the way kind of data centers are perceived as one thing. But everything from a carrier hotel, which uses very little power, but is probably the most critical part of, of the digital sort of architecture, right? All the way down to like the huge gigawatt mega campuses out in in rural parts of the country, like they're all called data centers, right? And it's two completely different things. So I think, yeah, that's been a real sort of interesting piece to kind of navigate. I think both just reading articles, on the daily of like, what is this article actually talking about? Because like I can't tell, once you actually kind of know that layer of like behind the scenes. So
Yeah, and a lot of people are curious, what is AI? What's it mean? What's the data center? How's it function? And realistically, if you pick up your phone, and we'll probably talk more about this in the questions later, but if you pick up your phone, every single one of those apps is probably integrating AI. Before they integrated AI, they probably had a data center sitting behind them, and now they have increased capacity. They need to run through additional data center space. So the actual usage, how it integrates in our life, is everywhere. Everything with AI, which is all the technology around us, all the smart home appliances, um, anything smart with your car, all of this ties into AI and then more directly ties into data centers. So it really touches us. Even though most people know absolutely nothing about them, it touches their lives at all different aspects.
Yeah, I thought that's why it was important to have this discussion and to have you both on. Dillon, I want to start with you. You started as an MEP design engineer at DLB Associates. You moved into construction management, then co-location and site selection. Now you've co-founded Colossus. So at what point did data centers stop being one of the things you worked on and become the thing?
yeah, I mean, to be honest, most of my relevant career, I mean, early on, I worked for the Navy for a bit, helping them with submarines. And after that, I worked for a laboratory equipment manufacturer. But kind of since then, I grew up in the trades, doing construction, trade work, and wanted to apply my mechanical engineering degree to the construction industry. So that's how I found sort of the MEP world of the building design. And once, sort of my first project was, at the time, a revolutionarily large, 2.5 megawatt data center. And once, I was on site for that from ground break through commissioning. And in today's world, 6 months from ground break to commissioning is almost impossible in many, instances. But that was, from then it was pretty much nothing but data centers. I did the control system design and installation for them for a while, which really helped me understand every aspect of these facilities and how they operate on almost like the code that really runs how they function. And then got, kind of slowly wanted to understand more and more who was building these and why. And that kind of led me through the rest of my career trying to get earlier and earlier in the process, to where people were defining the actual engineering design. But beyond that, like what's the actual business need for these and why are they being built? And that's sort of the journey that kind of led me through my career to this point.
Nathan, your path to data centers is quite unconventional. You had a background in commercial real estate, focusing on properties with high power usage, then movie studios and medical marijuana facilities before landing into data center development. So, how did you get to where you are now?
Well, as you know, brokers in New York, especially commercial real estate brokers, are a dime a dozen. So I had to find what made me stand out from the crowd. And early on, I realized in the city, it's all office. Everyone's doing office. But in the outer boroughs, there's a whole type of mix of businesses going into flex spaces. And any type of industrial user would get shunned by everyone because no one wanted to deal with their power needs. So I found this big pool of clients that needed space and no one wanted to deal with them. And it was a slow progression, but I'll say, like anything else in life, generally there's two paths. You can do the path through education like Dillon, or more like this of learning on the job. And it was a slow progression over 10 years, starting with small, IT closets or a user that needed 2,000 amps instead of 1,000 amps, very basic small things. And over a 10-year span before I got into the data center world properly, it just progressed upwards. The KWs went to NWs, kilowatts to megawatts. Projects got larger. The infrastructure needs got more intense and far more complex. But as I progressed, I worked through the processes. I leaned on experts at every area. And there hit a point where I stopped working with utilities and I moved up to working with ISOs and RTOs to secure load through interconnection packages. And then, not really, but one day I woke up and I was leading multi-100 megawatt data center and renewable energy plant developments. So it in this 50 seconds, it sounds quick, but that's like a 15-year progression right there. So
not a bad place to be. Dillon, let's talk about the AI elephant in the room. Everyone's building AI workloads, but what happens if the AI boom cools off or shifts, right? Is there a scenario we have overbuilt data center capacity sitting empty, or does demand for processing and storage just absorb it?
Yeah, I think there's a perception challenge, right? Perception is that like everything that's being built right now everywhere is for AI. And I think one that's incorrect. Like the cloud, what we've been building over the last decade, right? Like the cloud regions and processing, compute, storage, all of the traditional compute needs, like everyone's Instagram accounts and Facebook profiles and TikToks and Snapchats, like all that stuff's got to sit somewhere, right? And so a lot of the development going on is still supporting those workloads. I think the biggest risk exists in locality, right? So, there's a lot of stuff going on in remote rural areas that don't sit on key fiber corridors. So if you think about the internet is a very physical thing, I think that's probably the biggest gap between like the general public and the infrastructure behind what controls and operates all the things that really make our modern lives what they are. It's a very physical thing. The architecture of it is wires in the ground. If you send an email from LA to New York, you can physically trace the wires. A lot of the stuff that's being built for AI, just due to ease of access to power, AI machine learning, right? The actual building of these models requires huge clusters of GPUs that draw a tremendous amount of power. That needs to get built very quickly, efficiently, because all these groups are trying to outcompete each other. The nations are trying to outcompete each other on who can develop these models as efficiently and as quick as possible. The risk I see exists in if there's a point where the models are trained. Now they need to be deployed close to local markets, GDP for low latency, access to users. If something changes where we don't need to have these model training facilities anymore. It's a very specific use case. There isn't really a reusability profile that fits that. You are not near major fiber corridors, major cloud regions. You're out in the middle of nowhere with very cheap power and maybe one non-redundant fiber access to the rest of the community. And I think there is, the biggest thing that the industry was focused on for my entire, a couple of decades that I've been aware that it's been operating, has changed in the last maybe 3 to 5 years of the risk profile of like these projects, right? Like you were always trying to design it to be as flexible as humanly possible to accept the widest array of potential uses and, ensure that there was a tenant pool. A lot of this stuff is being almost nearly built to suit for chips. Like here's the new chip model. We're going to build an entire facility that's optimized to run this chip. What happens in 6 months? The chip technology is completely different, or things change. I think there's not a lot of thought going into that right now, just due to the fact of like it's this it's this, there's money to be spent, it needs to get invested, and this is where all the attention's at. I think that is really where the biggest risk lies, is not in a particular type of facility or use or the industry as a whole, but in a particular place and locality that like a certain use type is being deployed.
Nathan, what are your thoughts?
So I think bubble is a strong word. I would say something along the lines of there's a natural progression of time to power. And as we move through that, the curve will flatten. I think an aspect to think about is the actual development of data centers generally happens when a user is committed, if it's a developer that's, like Meta or someone who develops their own data centers, they'll usually start building once they have load committed to operate in those data centers. So the actual money is not spent till something's secured. And the same with build to suit data center developers. A lot of them will only actually develop the site once the user has committed to it and started funding it. A lot of the spec developers who are just searching the land for anything right now don't actually start development. They'll do early stage. So they'll secure the land, they'll secure initial load with power, and they'll secure permits and all that fun stuff. But they haven't spent real money. So potentially there's a whole lot of spec sites that would end up empty. But I think the actual built sites, there's a limitation on how many of those would end up being just left out because of the sheer amount of money it takes to develop them. I think that at some point, if you realize if you're building a 50 megawatt site and you're 400 million into a $500 million build and something happens, you're going to find a way to reposition at that point because you're so deep into the cost, you can't turn around. So I think the limitation of actually built data centers that could go vacant is limited.
So you believe that there's more risk with the actual built sites than actually developing one per se. Is that
I mean, there's always going to be more risk because there's substantially more dollars that go into a built one. But I
right?
think the amount of ones that actually get built will align much closer to the need at whatever time they finish than the concept now that there's trillions of dollars pouring in and there's going to be data centers popping up all over the place. And at some point, we'll hit the limitation of how many we need and we'll have all these extras.
I think what's sort of one thing we've seen is like what's challenging is the credit profile, right? Of like who you would give $1 billion to, right? Was a pretty high bar to meet for a long time. What we're seeing now is really creative financial engineering structures to enable where like the tenant who's underpinning the lease maybe didn't exist 2 years ago, right? And maybe they won't exist 2 years from now, but there's some other group that's involved in the mix that's sort of saying like, hey, I'll come in and backstop this group, like, and do that. And the question is like, how many times are they doing that? And at what scale and what exposure do they have? And would it only take one of those backstopping groups, to fall out to kind of like, completely blow apart a lot? And it's really, in my opinion of what I've seen, it's this stuff that's like outside of the normal data center site selection criteria, right? Like a lot of what's in sort of West Texas. If you talked about a data center in North Dakota in 2019, you would have got laughed out of the room, right? It's stuff like that I think entertains the most risk. I think it's solely because it's brand new, but it's being treated due to the fact that like all data centers are the same as, like from the public's perception as the same. And I think it is a slightly different risk profile than the rest of the industry really has, because like, I mean, AWS cloud isn't going away tomorrow, right? Like Outlook and Azure, like those are the most of the data centers built prior to probably 2022. We're focused exclusively on supporting cloud regions, enterprise facilities supporting, United Airlines, their apps and all their stuff. Like that stuff isn't going away, and there's really, in my opinion, no risk to that side of the market. But this like, really focused AI thing that's honestly absorbing probably 80% of the capital, that's going out right now is I think the the thing that's like it may be fine, but I think the question remains, right? It's not a tested product type that like really has proven stability.
And to add to that, in reference to like credit profiles, as with every new industry, there's a lot of, I'll call them brokers, popping up at every level of the business who are trying to insert themselves. So they will secure the load from a developer and then try to flip it. They will buy a batch of transformers and try to flip it. Sort of every aspect of the process is now having these additional parties try to insert themselves in the middle, and it complicates everything. And especially if a company is new to this industry, they can end up having a lot of pitfalls there because they just don't know what they're getting into.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because you're definitely always in any type of business or any type of popular asset class, you're going to see more and more middlemen being involved. And of course, it does create a more complex environment. So I'm glad you brought that up. Nathan, when we're talking about power, a lot of people think that power availability wall will hit around 2030 or 2031. Walk us through what that actually means for the market.
Sure. So I think we need to look at the power grid. There's generally two reasons we're sort of hitting that wall. One is our grid was created a long time ago, 50, 60, 70 years ago. And there's generally no redundancy in it. Whatever's generated is put out there, and there's usually loss. So for example, OG&E in Oklahoma is part of the SPP, Southwest Power Pool. They need to produce 112% of load to be part of SPP. Line losses are between 4 and 12% generally. So whatever they produce is going straight to users. So that's item number one, is we don't have extra power running through the lines that you can just plug into. In addition to that, we as a society are growing. We have more people living now than ever before. And we have more electrical uses and electronics in our lives than we've ever had before. So there is just this sheer amount of power need that hasn't been addressed in the past. So that wall is basically us hitting the end of what we have today in the way of kilowatts or megawatts to use, and the amount of time it takes to stand up new generation. If you've worked with RTOs, ISOs, the overarching organizations that manage sections of the grid throughout the country, the processes are long and complicated, involving substantial studies and upgrades and all types of fun things. So the challenge is getting the new generation online as quickly as possible, and it's just not a quick thing. If you look at PJM, they froze their queue. So the queue is the way you put new projects in. They froze it. I think initially they were going to freeze it for 7 years. They froze it for about 5 years. So for 5 years, nothing was progressing towards new generation, or it was progressing extremely slow. They had something like 98% behind on schedule for all their projects. So it's getting new generation online is the challenge.
Yep. And I think one thing to add to that is like I think data centers get a lot of the bad rep for us reaching the sort of top end. And then like to echo what you said, Nathan, like the grid was built in the, probably 70 years ago, right? And it was expanded bit by bit, and sort of in the way, I think part of this is the way that the grid is regulated really does not incentivize advancement or growth. It is meant to give groups legal monopolies over territories, establish a system to trade power across the country, and to enable incremental, like success-based growth at, fixed returns for these utility companies. It is not meant to handle a massive sort of power boom. And like, so they built the grid, it grew. And as, over time, from the 70s, as more and more technology came into our lives, the technology that existed became more efficient. So really there was really no load growth for a very long time. So there was no incentivization to keep improving the electric grid. And then what's happened in probably the last, 10, 15 years is that has gone almost exponential as compute has grown, our uses have grown, electric vehicle charging, like all of this stuff has come onto the system, but the grid hasn't done anything. So, and the way it works, right, is they built all this stuff and then they amortize it across all their users, and then everyone has a cost of, the cost of power. As we fully utilized the grid, costs of power kept coming down and down and down because there was more and more utilization of what had been built. And now once you hit the top, every new load requires new transmission lines, new generation, new distribution systems, new transformers. The whole system basically has got to be, it effectively would make more sense to start over with a much better and more modern system than it would to keep expanding the new one. That would require a completely different sort of regulatory structure, which is probably like a 45-year type solve than anything else. But, and now, whenever a new data center were to come in and say, I need 500 megawatts of load, it's effectively like, okay, give us, a $250 million to go securitize that, the output of a new generation plant we're going to have to site and construct. Please securitize your minimum, monthly utilization payments. That's typically 80% of the load you're asking for. This needs to be, this is 5 years before your data center is even built. You need to put up, probably almost $1 billion of securitization that they can one day draw against in the event that you aren't hitting the minimum utilizations you promised you would. So really, there is no, like the way it's structured currently, like there are no, the grid and local, users and residential users are not funding the growth of the data centers utilization of the grid. They would be funding, if there's a new apartment complex going down the street or a new hospital that needs 5 megawatts, right? Like all of that stuff, that power is all gone. So like, to build that, the utility company's got to go out and build new substations. That's getting amortized over the entire rate base. So of course your rates are rising. And it's just this weird moment of like something that was always going to happening, at a time where we're at this like advanced, peak of like technological, momentum. So it's just like that's getting blamed for something when it's really, was always going to happen anyway.
Yeah, and
go ahead, Nathan.
Oh, if I can quickly add to that, there's sort of two parts to that Dillon went through. There's the generation and then the transmission. And both of those are very substantial costs. A new generation plant can be hundreds of millions into the many billions, depending what you're developing. And I've seen on transmission upgrades, just under 200 million on a not very large project. So it depends what's in the lines and how much you can add to it. And to break it down a little bit for a place that has very few data centers, New York City and Long Island. New York City is in the process of getting a new line from Ontario called Chippy. It's this 1,200 megawatt gen-tie that's coming all the way down to Hudson. It's going to bring power right into the city. New York City has got some power closets in it. It doesn't have any major data centers, but they're short on power. And then Long Island specifically, 40% of their power comes from New Jersey and Connecticut. They're already at capacity, and no one's building huge data centers on Long Island. I mean, these are places that are running out of their available load, and it's not data centers that are causing that. So it is a real problem in major urban hubs.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because there needs to be eventually grid upgrades, right? I mean, the whole grid in New York City is, I don't even know how old. You could probably answer that. How is that going to get solved? How are we going to rebuild the grid in these major cities so that they're not using power from other states?
I mean, believe it or not, Edison built most of the grid and that still operates in like North Jersey and New York. Like it's legitimately that old. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge opportunity here if the narrative, I think there's a huge opportunity for opponents to data center growth and AI in general to use this narrative to kind of, paint data centers as like one of the reasons why you wouldn't want one in your community or your neighborhood. It's going to raise everyone's energy rates. But it essentially is kind of completely counterintuitive to what it does. Like once we've reached this point in the grid where every load, whether you're building your house and you need, 100 amps, right? And like that's going to require a new substation up the street. Like that's going to get rate based. Everyone's got to pay for it. If a data center comes and we need new 230 transmission lines to then bring power to this, new power to this community, the folks of that community would be paying for it. If the data center's there and is the one sort of causing that line to come in, and like they're paying for the full cost of that line. And then, the whatever the excess capacity of it is would then be, utilized by the utility to serve the community. So it really is a way to help have these large technology groups subsidize the local, and sort of regional economic growth of an area where otherwise they're staring down the barrel of $1 trillion in upgrades to just even unlock, the next set of power, right? Like you need to build all these new generation stations, and whether or not you can or can't build natural gas, because I think that the type of generation matters, and that's probably something we'll get into a bit later. But these are huge bills that if it were to get rate based, would blow people's energy rates out of the water if the data center wasn't able to come in and actually subsidize those increases.
Yeah, I think there needs to be more education on that because I do think probably a lot of these locals who are probably thinking that the data center is going to cause a lot of issues with their power or their electric bills are going to go up. I think having what you just stated would kind of ease that kind of concern that they would have.
And I think for clarity, like there were instances certainly where there were negative impacts, but early on, as probably 3, 4 years ago when we went from building 50, 60 megawatt facilities that were mostly handled off the transmission grid and moved into these huge multi-hundred megawatt projects where sites were building their own substations, taking high voltage power. Like utilities got super excited to see, these groups coming in and say, hey, you're gonna take 500 megawatts. Like, oh my God, we've been dreaming about this for years. And they got really excited, rolled into it, invested a bunch of money in their infrastructure. The data center never happened. And, and all of that stuff that the utility spent got rate based, everyone's rates went up and nothing happened. That is no longer the way this is structured. Like at least, every utility is different. Every state PUC regulates their own utilities, and then the FERC kind of sits on top of all of that, making sure everyone plays by the rules. But so it's always different. But for the most part, I haven't seen a project in the last year and a half where like the data center, before you could even sign your electric service agreement, the data center company has to put up at least almost $500 million worth of money to cover all of this stuff. So that there's no risk on the side of the utility or the public. So as long as it's operating that way, I really don't see how the narrative holds up that like these are raising utility rates.
And I would just add to that, though, I feel like this is a multi-generational thing. This is the first time we as a country are properly hitting the capacity of our grid. It didn't happen to our parents. It didn't happen to our grandparents. Sure, there were upgrades here and there, and the cost of gas went up and whatnot that caused rate increases. But this is the first time where the grid is done. It's full, and we actually need to substantially change that. And I think I just ran across a statistic the other day that some groups are estimating by 2040 our power load could increase by 25 to 50%. And if you look at how generation is built, generation is planned now and built in 4 or 5 years. I don't think there's anything close to realistic that we could plan now and fund now developments to hit that type of increase by 2040. It's just not going to happen.
So basically, you're saying we gotta blame the Gen Zers for what is to come in the future. Yeah, because what I remember is I was really bored for most of my childhood, and now you have all these kids who are constantly using their phones or iPads. So we are definitely in a different age. Nathan, renewables are positioned as the silver bullet for data center energy, but I think the reality is a little bit more complicated, right? So what is a realistic energy mix today? Or is natural gas still the power that's going to still be needed for these data centers, if you admit it or not?
No one's going to like my answer on this. Natural gas is still the backbone. Um, we have a mix of renewables that here in the US we're using and looking at and studying, and around the world there's a very large mix of renewable powers. But right now, if you look at what we're using in the US, nuclear is very unpopular with the US. You had Indian Point up in Westchester shut down. Was that 20 years ago, 10 years ago? Americans have never adjusted to nuclear. It's also extremely expensive. Um, way to go, though it is very good. Hydrogen, which is new, is lacks total infrastructure across the country. Sure, we could repurpose a fair amount of pipes and things, but a huge lack of infrastructure, and it's an extremely expensive route to go. And then there's a lot of talk about the small nuclear DERMs. No one's figured out how to make those yet anywhere in the world. They don't exist yet. And then you've got solar, wind, and batteries. Solar and wind are great. They're not cheap. They're more expensive than gas. When we made the transition from petroleum to gas, it was easy because gas was cleaner and healthier. But now we're trying to make the transition from natural gas to these renewables, and it's challenging because it's not cheaper. It's substantially more expensive in many aspects. And they don't run all day. Battery and wind can't sustain 24 hours. Solar and wind can't sustain 24 hours. And then we add battery, but battery is extremely expensive, and there's a lot of fear around it. I've heard people saying it's like having a nuclear bomb in your backyard. It's not. It's an extremely safe technology, but there's a lot of fear around it, and fear is a very powerful motivator. And I would say if you look at a state like New York, sorry to keep going back to New York, but they're a great example. In 2019, they passed very aggressive green climate goals, emission reductions by 40% from the 1990 levels by 2030, 85% reduction by 2050, 6 gigawatts of battery running by 2030. They've already halved that to 3 gigawatts, and I think that's falling painfully short right now. And power prices have increased I think over 25%. And last year they did a study and said if they were going to try to go all the way and hit those goals, it would knock power prices up by at least that same increase, if not more. And then you look at the infrastructure in New York. They haven't given air permits to gas plants in over 5 years. ArcLight, who operates many gas plants in and around New York City, hasn't done any upgrades in 5-6 years because when something breaks, they just retire it. They can't get capital if they don't have line of sight for long-term operations. Over 40% of the gas plants in New York are over 50 years old. 7% of them are over 70 years old. Gas is still the backbone, but a state like New York has specifically tried to move away with it, but not been able to figure out a path forward. So they're going to need to make a very important decision soon on which direction they're going to go. And their load growth estimates from last year sort of blew them out of the water for what's going to happen. So there's a lot of question marks. Renewables right now are not going to save them.
Yeah, and I think you touched on anything but the scale, right? Like even if you could figure out a weird battery solution with solar and wind and all of this together with a battery, but this, once you hit, at like a 10 to 50 megawatt range, like maybe something works. Once you start getting outside of that, the scale of the battery you need becomes so just financially infeasible that it just really kind of kills the whole thing as a way to power at least 24/7 load like data centers. When that's why you've seen such probably pervasive news about natural gas projects, behind the meter solutions, fully off grid, or even on grid combined solutions. I think there's a lot of ambiguity there on how realistic that is as a way forward, just because there are many places in the country you just simply cannot build natural gas generators because of the EPA air quality regulations. And the one route is to remove those, right? And then the air is gray like it is in China in certain places, right? Like that's one route. The other is nuclear. Nuclear, like you mentioned, has its own set of problems, right? It's there's no existing supply chain of nuclear fuel to scale that industry in the US, meaningfully in a quick term. The second piece is you can barely get a data center entitled. I couldn't imagine trying to get a nuclear reactor permitted anywhere in the country right now. And then you'll probably read an article about somebody getting rights or permission, or they're starting work on a reactor here or there or Wyoming or this or that. And you can read 50 articles that are promising you that a reactor is coming online. The truth of the matter is no new nuclear power plants, full net new nuclear power plants, have been built since the like mid 70s. So that's over, 50, reactors have been added to existing plants and things like they've expanded, but no new plants have been built since the 70s. So like that's a huge generational knowledge gap of just like trial and error, things that haven't, worked or gotten right or wrong that like, these are incredibly complicated projects. And the reason why most, a lot of like, there was this huge power boom in like the late 60s, early 70s. Everyone went out and said, we're going to build all these nuclear reactors. All the projects went like so far over budget, they canceled them. And everyone's power rates like shot through the roof. I think there was a ton of issues out in like Washington and the Pacific Northwest with that type of stuff. So, and that was when the technology was like really in focus. It had been worked on for generations and generations. Now no one's touched it, at least in the US for a very long time. So I think it being the silver bullet on that side of things that fixes everything is also a huge kind of outlier. I know the federal government's been trying to ease the regulations around nuclear to kind of spur development, but I think there's going to be a ton of potential political pushback on that from the perspective of like, why are we easing the regulations that are meant to protect us from these incredibly dangerous technology? So yeah, I think there's just a lot to be had there.
And if I can add to that, late 2024 going into 2025, PJM, which covers New Jersey, Pennsylvania, a whole bunch of I think the largest ISO by geography, did a special, I think it was called the RRI or RRII program to do uprates or new developments. Uprates is when you have an existing power station and you have one or two turbines or units that are not running, you enter them into the queue to rerun them. So they did this expedited process, and they weighted it in a very interesting way where nuclear was weighted the highest for the way they were judging it, because I think they're only passing, it's like 50 projects through. And then solar and battery got rough ratings, and gas was like in the middle, but it was sort of designed to expedite the types of things they saw that could create constant generation versus renewables that would create partial generation. And someone did put in an uprate for 3 Mile Island, so we'll see how that turns out. But there's panic even at the ISO level right now for growth.
For our audience, can you define ISO, please?
Sure. It's the interconnection service territory, or sometimes some of them are called RTOs, regional transmission organization. They're basically, the country is split into, was it like 7 or 8 of these organizations that manage the grid in their area. So all the utilities have to work through them when dealing with any type of large load. So if new load is coming on, it has to go through them. And then in addition, they do all the studies in tandem with the utilities of looking at the lines. Where can transmission move? Where can it go? They are sort of like the overarching middle management between the utilities and FERC, which is the federal organization that manages the grid in the U.S.
Yeah. I think a good sort of thing to add for like people who don't understand the way that it works, right, is like the reason why those are needed is because like energy transfer is live, like there is no storage. So every kilowatt that's being consumed needs to be generated, right, like at the same point in time. So you need, someone with their finger on the pulse, not only trading power and moving it around within their ISOs, but between the ISOs. If it's really hot in one area of the country and like, they might be short on generation capacity, another area has different, they have to sell between those in order to kind of make up the balance. So I think just to provide a little more context for like why it seems so arbitrarily complicated, it's that, and that's also the reason why it's so hard to grow and expand the grid, is because even within those RTOs, each utility is regulated differently, has different processes for how they take on load, or some utilities are totally vertically integrated where they want to build their own generation as part of their offering platform. Other utilities are completely deregulated and have no responsibility. Within PJM, that's a pretty common theme where like a utility will sell you the wires for something, but there's no guarantee that by the time they deliver those wires, there's any like actual electrons on the grid and it's not their job, right? Like it's a deregulated market. So I think that is sort of an interesting dichotomy of like why this is so hard to fix. It's because it's so decentralized.
Yeah, Dylan, is that the reason why you're seeing a lot of these groups zeroing on like smaller sites, like 30 to 7 megawatts? Because you
Yeah,
could, yeah, go ahead.
yeah. I mean, one, there's, I think, so there, like I mentioned early on, there's like two ends to the spectrum of data centers. You could think of it like, distribution in an industrial setting, right? Like you have the big offsite bomber, distribution facilities. Then you have kind of last mile delivery. And there really is a huge gap in the industry around that piece of it. Everyone has been like, oh, if I can go deploy 2 billion out, where there's guaranteed fast power, it's cheap. There's barely any entitlements I need to get. Like that seems way better for a project that's going to require the same amount of energy and work for 30 megawatts in downtown Seattle or LA or Dallas, right? Like those are very, very difficult projects to make happen. The difference is they're much more fungible, right? And understandable material. Like there's an existing real estate basis that makes sense, right? If you obtain power and maybe it doesn't work as a data center, there could be other uses, right? Like it's a much more palatable sort of real estate play. And I think we've started to see a lot of groups kind of hone in on that, especially given that there's a large kind of focus on the big stuff, where many of the smaller players can't really get a footing. This smaller stuff, is much more manageable. It's the way the industry has historically worked for forever. There's a traditional real estate group that's like net leasing a facility that has like access to a good amount of power. And a tenant comes in, builds to their spec, and it just kind of works very, very naturally.
Nathan, is that where you think the smart money is going right now, or is hyperscale still the main event?
Different needs for different companies. A company like who's properly a hyperscaler can't realistically set up 20, 50 megawatt sites. It's just not realistic for their operation. They wouldn't know how to function and they couldn't manage it. But I think a disproportionate amount of users don't need 100 megawatts. I think that's where a lot of the information gets lost. A lot of the users don't need these mega sites. The smaller sites are much easier to do. And I'll add to that, if someone can function on a tier 1, tier 2, where they don't need a second feed of power, that sort of opens up the world to them. To be able to find a site with a single feed is exponentially easier than finding a site with a double feed. But there are challenges to having these small sites. I'll leave the name out, but I know a group that's got 14 data centers ranging from and this is a well-known name that most people have heard of in the data center world, very well respected, but they've got 14 different sites ranging from 2 megawatts up to 25 megawatts scattered around the country. The operational and management needs of all those sites is very challenging for them because they don't have one main office or 3 main offices where they can manage everything. They need people at every single site. They need an office at every single site. They need these specific needs, and it's very challenging to be spread out so much. In addition, and Dillon touched on this before, I'm not going to say it's easy to find power, but you can find power out there, but it may not be near anything. So say you're developing a 50 megawatt site and you're 100 miles from the closest city and 70 miles from the closest reasonable airport. It's challenging to staff that. If you need, I don't know, let's say 50 workers, 40 workers there, where you're going to have a very hard time relocating them. It's not going to be competitively priced to relocate them, and you're going to lack the expertise there to do it. And that's not even touching on fiber, which is definitely not near that. So there are pluses to being small and sort of going out there and finding them, but there are a lot of additional challenges. The farther you get from cities, the challenges multiply. It's just not get a little bigger, they multiply.
Yeah, it seems like you need to have like a team structure set up for each site so that you're able to have that oversight onto each data center that you build or existing site, so that you could operate it a lot more efficiently.
Yeah, it really depends on the exact structure, right? Like if you're a landlord, maybe your tenant is the one who has that existing nationwide structure. If you're a group looking to start a co-location business. I think I've been told that many times. People were basically going out and trying to start a data center operating business. It is an incredibly challenging feat, and an incredibly challenging business to be in, insanely capital intensive, insanely complicated from a compliance and liability perspective of what you offer to your tenants and how you uphold that. I will say the easy button we've seen deployed a lot is people will hire like a third party facility management group, like a JLL, Salute, one of those guys to like just operate the, CBRE as well. Like I think they all offer like operations teams that they can just drop in. So I think that's one solution there. But to echo Nathan's point, like it's this balancing act of the further you closer you get to cities, the more valuable this asset is. Also, the more challenging it is to create that value. The zoning, the entitlements, the access to power, the potential for pushback from people in the area. As you get further away from that sort of core, those carrier hotels, I think is really like the central node of the further you get from that, the less and less value that power has. Like if you had 50 megawatts in the middle of the desert, I don't think anybody's going to care. There's just not a need for that. At least today. Who knows? I would have. Like I said, the stuff we were saying 3 years ago is no longer valid anymore. So, but as of today, that really seems to be this like balancing act of like getting as close as you can while not getting, sort of into a point where there is no power and there's no way you're going to get your project approved. Is it's a bit of a balancing act.
Yeah, you were just talking about the pushback that builders and developers are getting from towns.
Yeah.
And they have these moratoriums, and they're confusing data centers with warehouses. So there's like a real education gap. So how do you bridge that gap? Like whose job is it?
Yeah, it's the pushback has reached a level of which I've never seen in my career, that you truly cannot, like we're seeing pushback in rural areas, in pro-development communities, nearly everywhere in the country. This narrative has gotten out of control that the rates will rise, that it's going to use all of the water, that it will poison your children. The emissions from the generators, right, are going to like people won't be able to practice soccer at the local high school, all of this stuff. And it just spirals out of control because there's no one actually controlling the narrative from the pro side, right? There's only folks, creating, networks of, and there are national anti-data center sort of groups who kind of, insert themselves into local, sort of politics and then kind of create this like grassroots, like, momentum. And once it's started, it's almost impossible to regain control over the narrative. But in reality, very few data centers are, use any water, really. They use these closed loop cooling systems that truly don't draw on the region's water system. You fill it up and then it stays full. Maybe you top it off a few times a year. It's really less than you would at any industrial or, even a couple, fast food restaurants would likely use more water than these facilities. The power rate, we talked about that. And then, the last piece is like all of the generation stuff all fit under the existing emissions caps of what you can do and what you can build. Your allotted testing hours throughout the year, so you don't exceed any level of emissions. That the noise can be properly mitigated with barriers, berms, attenuation, setbacks. All of the problems that are raised are easily solved. It's just becoming this thing of like all political parties against tech, like or against the development of data centers. So there really doesn't seem to be any alignment on that. It does seem to be the one thing that both sides can agree on is that they don't want data centers near their homes. So I think it's a bit, one, it's education. There are a ton of benefits from a property tax, sales and use tax perspective. Like the example I always use, if you walk around, Ashburn, Northern Virginia, Fairfax, Loudoun counties, you look at the parks, sidewalks, and schools, it feels like you're in this futuristic, like utopia, right? It's gorgeous. They gain such an extreme proportion of their, the income from the property taxes from the data centers that it's like, they just have so much money to improve roads, create sidewalks, walkable areas, parks. The one thing they didn't get ahead of early enough was defining the criteria of how they wanted the data centers to look. It's something they've gotten ahead of now, but like, inducing proper setbacks, building heights, like, as long as the community can have a say in, in setting the standards of how this thing gets developed, there really is a ton of benefits, even, extending to the sort of utility upgrade, benefits that it can sort of help reduce like the rates are going to go up regardless if the data center comes or not. They'll go up less, right? If the data center does come in and help subsidize, and not all cases, but in many. So I think it's really that. Who should be doing this? I think it's a lot of these huge tech companies have sort of, the data center industry was, I think, always clouded in secrecy, right? The goal was don't let anyone know where your highly critical infrastructure is, right? From a security risk perspective. And that trended to this like cloak and dagger, secrecy, everything's NDA'd, no one wants to share information. And that has now translated to the public in this like really negative way. And I think they need to, the heads of all these companies and they need to start, actually broadcasting many of the things I, just kind of brought up and like really explaining the narrative and talking about this as it's like an extension of your Tesla or your iPhone, right? Like this is part of that. And like, every time you go on TikTok, right? Or anything, every email you send is passing through this facility, right? Like that narrative needs to get explained more of like why we're doing this. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I want to mention to kind of educate the masses who do think as data centers being a negative, a CBRE report says that each direct job in the data center industry creates an average of 7.4 ancillary jobs across the broader economy, including construction, maintenance, and local services.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, so construction without a doubt, I mean, sure Nathan could speak to this, but it's thousands of people on site. They build towns to support some of these things on the big ones. But on the other side, the thing I think doesn't get talked about at all really is the local trade group exposure on like a 15 to 20-year duration, right? Like there are thousands of air filters that need to get changed. There are how much diesel fuel needs to get, the maintenance on the engines, all the electrical gear needs inspections and work. And that's all going to be pulled from the local trade and labor pool. So like, I even think the estimates you gave are probably pretty low. Like it's really hard to quantify because it's over many years and it's not like, some things people are tracking, but I think that is a really, huge thing to point out, especially in heavy trade, economies.
Yeah, from almost any aspect of the development, it is a strong financial increase for the community. But it's challenging because often communities have no idea what this is. And I'll give a great example. I was working in a small town in Texas trying to develop a data center, and their zoning code had no data centers. The closest they felt was BESS, utility scale battery storage, which is not close at all. That required plume data, if it would ignite, like all types of studies. A data center doesn't have large lithium ion battery packs. Like there was this strong disconnect about the data they wanted to review that didn't exist for this type of development. So it's a matter of bringing the minds together. You think about a zoning board, to circle back a little bit. A zoning board's usually volunteer people from the community. They have a day job, they do stuff. They're used to hearing about someone trying to put, the Joneses want to add another bedroom. That's the type of thing they're used to hearing about. This is totally out of their world. So it's important to educate them. And I think one of the best groups to always get in front of very early is the fire department, the safety side of things. Educate the fire department on what it is, how it functions, and how they solve it. And if there's new equipment the fire department needs, it's on the developer or the operator to supply that. The fire department operates like automatically. They have a process they go through. If you're changing that process for a new type of use, it's on you to be the one to spur that change.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest misconception too, right? Is like, can a data center be 100 feet tall, incredibly loud, right up against the neighbors with like diesel generators next to their swimming pools? Yes. Does it have to be? No. There are just as many data centers that are a single story, maybe 25 feet tall, that have 400-foot setbacks, that you can't hear anything from the property line. Like it really depends. It's the community's job. Like if you let these groups build it as cheaply as they want and as like, as over the top big, like there's huge scales of economy of condensing it down. But if you just don't allow that, but you got power, right? Like you can kind of call the shots on how they build this thing. And I really think it should be less of like a fear of like, we don't want this thing coming. then like, how do we use this to our benefit, right? Of how does this all work together in a harmony, and we can really make a project that not only benefits the community, but the tech company, and there is a broader sort of national security piece of continuing to grow our compute, because if we're not doing it, every other country in the world is. So there's an aspect of that as well.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. I want to talk about one aspect. If our audience members are interested in getting into the data center space, what advice would you give to them, and what mistake would you have them avoid?
Yeah, I'll use this opportunity for my plug, but I would say data centers are like as a traditional real estate asset class, far more complicated and like huge capex exposure. Procuring power has never been more challenging. The zoning and entitlement piece is now almost taking priority over access to power. It almost starting to make more sense to go find land that you can make a data center and figuring out how the hell you're going to get power there, as opposed to the other way around. But just broadly, I would say call us, Colossus Data Center Advisors. That's sort of what we do, is help folks where this isn't their sort of main area of expertise, whether it's diligencing an acquisition or trying to position something. That's sort of what we help folks do on the day to day.
Nathan?
So I was actually going to give a plug for Dillon as well. I was going to say, depend on the experts. Groups like Dillon's know this stuff. This is, with the way the industry's going, with the way the generation's going and the grid development is happening, this is not the time to jump in by yourself and just do it. It's extremely complex products with a massive amount of capital outlay. Even these spec sites are going to involve a lot of cash and a lot of time, comparatively small to the entire project. But there's a lot of upfront costs that you can easily blow through if you don't know what you're doing. So lean on the experts, groups like Dillon's who can lead you through this, developers who prep sites and can deliver you a shovel-ready site, stuff like that. CBRE has data center teams, JLL for finding sites, for managing sites. Lean on the experts. And I would say, for the thing to stay away from is, don't believe any timeline a utility or an ISO or RTO gives you. Add 25 to 50% on. The cost estimates, those could be realistic, but the timelines, be very generous with your extra time in there.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, plug, Nathan. And the last thing I think I'll add is, I think it's really easy in this space to find reasons to say yes. And I think our goal is always to help people understand how, like, what you're looking for to say no, right? Like there's always a reason. Like, could any site in the country be a data center site? Yes. Like that's the answer. It's like, how do you find the reasons to say no? Whether it's an existing building, an existing, portfolio of operating companies, whatever it is, how do you say no? And I think that's, sort of the really only way to gain that knowledge is just experience in the space. So, yeah.
I like that advice. That's something I actually take to heart when I'm looking at deals as an LP, is I'll actually go to the GP who's trying to sell me on investing on the deal. I'll say, tell me something that you don't like about the deal.
Mm-hmm.
So I could have them kind of think of it in a different way.
I mean, these days you got everybody yesing you to death. The utility will tell you it's all going to work out. It's going to be fine. Whatever natural gas generation companies involved. Oh, the turbine's going to be here in 3 months. We're going to have a gigawatt up. The contractors who tell you, everybody wants every job, especially the groups who like want exposure to digital infrastructure work that maybe haven't, contractors, engineers, everyone, they're going to yes you to death to get into the space. And I think it's, we've just seen a lot of that, like stuff move forward that, in my career, I would have said like, that's a 2% chance that'll ever happen. And it's happening. So I think, yeah, exactly that point is just like knowing what the criteria is of like, these people are clearly, are just trying to, rose-colored glasses, everything to me. And, here are the realities of the technology.
Before we go, this is CRE Unplugged. So I want to know, where would be one place in the world you would want to unplug with no phones, no emails, no electronics? Nathan, I'll start with you.
I'd probably choose something in the Caribbean right now. Almost any of them. Grenada, maybe. Just disappear for a while.
Yeah, for me, probably New Zealand. I'm a big hiker, and to be able to go to like the beaches and the mountains in the same day is pretty cool. So that's my spot.
Yeah, I haven't been to both, but they both sound like great places to go to. Um, well, thank you so much for coming on. Nathan and Dylan, where can our audience members find you or reach out to you?
Yeah, for me, it's we have a website, www.colossusdc.com. But yeah, feel free. I think we have a little like portal you could input, and we'll get back to you there if there's anything that we could be helpful with.
For me, probably the best is look me up on LinkedIn, Nathaniel Persky. The best spot to find me.
All right. Well, this was very informative. I learned a lot, and I'm so happy that I got to speak to both of you. And I really hope that we see a lot more changes and a lot more growth happening to the data center industry.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Ryan.
Thank
This
you.
was great.
Stay tuned for my recap after this word from our sponsor. Hey there, CRE Unplugged fam. We would like to give a huge shout out to our sponsor, the Game Changers over at Hilo, the customer experience platform for buildings that's turning heads in the real estate world.
That's right. Can we talk about how Hilo is transforming the way we manage properties and create unforgettable experiences? Ryan, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about Hilo?
Well, Nadine, it's all about reducing friction in property management. Hilo is like the magic wand that makes everything seamless and efficient. Say goodbye to those time-consuming tasks and hello to streamlined operations and communications.
Efficiency is crucial, but what about personalized experiences? Hilo takes it to the next level with a vision to tailor each interaction to the needs and preferences of its customers.
And let's not forget the community aspect. Hilo builds vibrant, connected communities. It's fostering a sense of belonging and togetherness.
Now, here's something that truly sets Hilo apart: their commitment to advancing ESG initiatives. They're not just about buildings, they're about making a positive impact on the environment. That's a win-win for everyone.
So, to our listeners out there, if you're ready to elevate your properties, digitize and enhance customer experience, and maximize satisfaction, Hilo is the answer. Please visit hiloapp.com for more information. That's hiloapp.com. What really struck me from this conversation is how many people are chasing data centers right now without understanding the fundamentals. Nathan and Dylan made it clear that having capital is not the same as having track record. And the developers who can't tell the difference are the ones that are creating real bubble risk. This space isn't about finding land and plugging in servers. It's about power procurement, utility relationships, construction timelines, and navigating community dynamics that most CRE professionals have never had to think about before. And on the community side, there's actually precedent worth paying attention to. Obama's Promise Zone initiative designated high poverty communities across the land to attract private capital and coordinate federal resources into areas that needed it the most. The concept was simple: use a place designated as a signal to investors and developers that this is where you should be building. The opportunity for data centers to serve as an economic engine or struggling communities is real, but it needs guardrails. Community benefit agreements, transparent tax revenue allocation, infrastructure commitments like fiber connectivity. Without those, the benefits flow to places that are already doing well, and the communities that need it the most are getting left behind. I also agree with Nathan and Dylan on the grid conversation. From my experience, I see how quickly narratives hold in an industry before anyone stops to look around what's really happening and looking at the numbers. The idea that data centers are destroying local power grids is one of those narratives. The truth is, these facilities are building and funding infrastructure upgrades that were neglected for decades. And if no one is breaking down for communities and local governments, decisions are being made in the dark. That's where technology can actually help. There are platforms right now like GatherGov, Shovel, Hamlet that use AI to analyze what local governments are talking about across the country, putting out insights on zoning discussions, community sentiment, and regulatory trends. For data center development, trying to understand how a town actually feels about how you're building the development before they show up to the site plan, that kind of intelligence is a game changer. That's exactly why shows like CRE Unplugged exist, to cut through the noise and give people the real story from practitioners, not pundits. On a personal level, Dillon and Nathan's point about people's town pushback on data centers while relying on the very technology that depends on them really made me reflect. It's a reminder that we're all connected to this industry, whether we realize it or not. For me, that's what reinforces why I'm so interested in educating the CRE community on what's actually happening in the space. Whether it's through this podcast or through the classroom that I teach at Baruch College, the goal is always the same. Help people see what's coming before it passes them by. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much to my guests, Dillon Zahler and Nathan Persky. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. If you have any questions that you want us to answer on air, you can email us at info@creunplugged.com or via our website at www.creunplugged.com. See you next time, and keep your conversations real and unplugged.